Hello. My topic was on the nature and role of Satan, and so it is with this in mind that I will go ahead and be discussing my thesis statement. The most theologically sound way for a 21st century Western Christian to think about the nature and role of Satan is not so much as a personal being whose essence is wholly evil. Rather, it should be considered in the light of a function that can be filled by any free agent, when they're acting in such a way that is an obstacle or a test against someone who's considered to be righteous. And when I talk about this, we will not be discussing everything about the devil or the enemy, the adversary. We will just be talking about Satan and the satanic. To do this, we will look at the biblical narrative from Old Testament to New Testament, including the intertestamental period. And then we'll look at some theological assumptions, and then we will synthesize all this to re-image what it means when we think of or hear about Satan and the satanic. To start off, we'll look at the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, there's little to no doctrine of Satan, really. And all the times that it's used in the Old Testament, it is only referred to in an angelic, superhuman being type of sense 4 times. 2 of those times are in Job, in which we see the Satan creature enter the divine court of God and then offer a proposition to God to test and tempt Job to see if he's actually righteous. Another instance is in 1 Chronicles, which is the retelling of the 2nd Samuel story. The 2nd Samuel story tells about how God incited David to take a census, which God had told David not to do. But then in the 1st Chronicles version, Satan is the one inciting David to take a census. Through other examples of the Old Testament, we see that the Satan figure is very much an agent of God. He might have more freedom to roam around than some of the other divine beings that we see in the Old Testament, but he is an agent of God. Then we enter the exilic period and get the intertestamental literature, the apocryphal literature, and we see all of a sudden these stories of origin stories of the one that is the enemy, the Satan. And these go from stories such as Samias, who leads a rebellion against God and leads a group of angels down to Mount Hermon to have children and sex and spread jewelry and greed and pride to humanity. And this is another creature associated with the Satan. Then we move into from there with these ideas of origin stories leading into the New Testament. And this is what the New Testament writers were given. They knew all these stories, and they had to relate this to the gospel. And so we get into the New Testament, and we see all these instances of Satan and the satanic powers. Jesus refers to Satan as the prince of this world, the ruler of this world, the ruler of demons. However, Peter is also called Satan by Jesus. And we have a couple other instances of other people being referred to as a Satan, though not always translated into English. So we see that this throughout the biblical narrative, this Satan figure always seems to act in a way, whether by the will of God or away from the will of God, in a function of attacking, tempting, testing someone who's righteous. Now we go into the theological assumptions from the early church to the 21st century. From the early church, we see this idea of the Satan and the satanic powers from the patristic fathers as holy evil, in charge of all the evil in the world, the prince of this world kind of idea. And we start to move through, and the Catholic Church especially has a lot of things during the catechisms, and the catechist would have to denounce Satan and the powers of Satan and things like that. And we even move closer to the 21st century in the West specifically, and there's been a surprising increase in the belief of Satan and the demonic. And even to the point where even in the secular culture they believe in an evil power, a Satan figure, and would agree with the idea that there is a Satan that exists, which is an interesting concept to synthesize these together. Now we move into the re-imaging process. Throughout the biblical narrative, we see that the Satan figure functions as a free agent that is either meant to or just is testing and tempting of his own free will other people that are considered righteous. Throughout the theological assumptions of the early church of the 21st century, we see this as well, that there's this overlaying pattern of the Satan figure testing and tempting, but not always being an angelic being, because it can be any free agent that acts in such a way that is purposefully tempting, testing someone who's considered to be righteous either by God or by men. Thank you.